Welcome to the SMS podcast. I'm here today to review the Speak No Evil remake directed by James Watkins, the guy who did Eden Lake, The Woman in Black, and it stars James McAvoy, my ex Mackenzie Davis, Scooter McNairy, Aisling Franciosi, and honestly, this remake is exactly the same as the original, except for the ending and a couple of changes, like the fact that they're British and American, unlike the original, in which they were Dutch and Danish. Also, the commentary is different, because this movie is commentating on toxic masculinity, which I guess I relate to, unlike the original, which was about Danish culture, unlike this one, which is so Hollywood basic ending of most horror or thriller movies that are similar to this. But I still did like this movie. It's not as good as the original, obviously, because of those reasons. The ending was so basic. But yeah, let's get into the movie. What is it about? It starts off exactly the same as the original. Well, most of the movies are exactly the same. They both meet in Italy, these two families. One this time is American, the other's British. James McAvoy plays Patty, the same name as the original. His wife's name is Kiera. Scoot McNairy's character is named Ben now instead of Bjorn. And my ex Mackenzie Davis's name in this movie is the same as the original, Luis. And it plays out exactly the same. They hit it off. There's a reference to the original in which there is this Danish guy there and they make fun of him. And they also don't really like him because he's so annoyingly polite, just like in the original. You also find out that neither Ben nor Louise have a job because Ben lost his job and Louise upended her life to get there. So they eventually get back to their place, and you notice that they live in this swanky apartment. You clearly see they have marriage problems because when Louise is on her phone, Ben is immediately fidgety, and Louise is like, well, here's my phone, you want to see? It's Agnes's tutor. At the same time, they get this postcard from Patty asking them to stay, but Louise is hesitant at first. Ben is just annoyed. He's like, whatever, guess we're not staying. But Louise agrees, and they set off to Patty's ranch, and we notice our first red flags in the room in which we see a brown stain, which you could say is shit, but it's pretty obvious that it's blood, but they just play it off as, oh, they live in the countryside. Their customs are different than ours. So then we get this scene in which they're hiking and they're singing the British national anthem, and we get the first big red flag in which they stumble upon this tree swing, and Patty tells his son, Ant, who's mute, just like in the original, to push Agnes in the swing, and he doesn't want to, and Patty violently grabs Ant, and Louise is just scared. She's like, whoa. Eventually Ant does it, but then also we see Louise the whole time, her neck's hurting, and then Patty does this major thing. He basically grabs her neck like they're together, and he's acting like he's trying to help out with the crick in her neck, and it's just so unnerving. And eventually Patty's like, oh, what'll fix this? And it immediately cuts to the next scene in which they're on top of this cliff and they're about to jump off. But Ben is like, well, we didn't bring our swimsuits. James McAvoy's like, it's okay, you can keep your knickers on. And while they're undressing, Kiera makes a comment like, oh, Louise, you have a great body. And she's like, thanks. And at the same time, James McAvoy winks at Ben, and it's so uncomfortable. So they all eventually jump off, except for Louise and Kiera, because Louise sees that Ant is struggling to swim, but James McAvoy's like, oh, don't worry about him. I've done this 1,000 times. You either learn to sink or swim. And Louise doesn't get into the water, of course. So after this, Louise is expressing that she's not comfortable staying there. But right when this happens, Kiera knocks on the door and asks if they'd like to go to dinner, and Ben just plays it off you see, they're so impolite. So we see that they're about to go to dinner, and they're both dressed like they're about to go to club. And we see basically it play out as it did in the original, that a babysitter is there for the kids, which is so weird. So we even get another car scene, except it doesn't really play out like the original. It's kind of like a reference to it, like they're driving insane, but not really to the effect of the car scene in the original. So they finally get to dinner, and it's this sweeping shot of where they're staying at. And like the original, so I forgot to mention about this other scene that's exactly like the original, in which Patty feeds Luis this goose with the fork. But this time, Luis spits it out immediately while they're not looking. And it's brought back up at the restaurant because Luis mentions that she's a pescatarian, and Patty brings it up like, what about the goose? And Ben is like, yeah, actually, she's a vegetarian. And he's like, oh, so sorry about that, mate. And we get this awkward dinner scene again. And this time, instead of the original where they awkwardly dance and make out, Kira gives him a fake blowjob this time, which was insane. But meanwhile, we cut back to the kids at the house, and they're playing hide and seek with the babysitter. And Ant shows Agnes his bruises and scars on his torso. And Agnes thinks that he did him himself, which makes no sense, but okay. So they immediately pretend to go to sleep because their parents get back at the same time. So then we cut to Ben and Luis arguing that Ben is salty that Luis said that he barely gets laid. Ben is embarrassed, of course. And we find out what this tension is in their marriage, that Luis cheats on him, but not really. She was sexting with this guy, even though this girl's in like her 30s. I don't think anybody's sexting in their 30s like they're in high school, but okay. At the same time, we see Patty spying on them. So Luis then wakes up in the middle of the night to check on Agnes, and she realizes that she's not in the room, and neither is Aunt. And she finds Agnes sleeping in the bed next to Kira, just like in the original, and it's awkward because they're both half naked. So of course Luis makes them all leave, but just like in the original, Agnes leaves her stuffed animal and they go back to get it. This time she has like autism because she's violently scratching herself. That's the reason they go back to get it this time, because she's like 12 years old now, and in the original she was 6 or 7 years old. But when this happens, they almost had a fucking truck, so overdramatic. So they go back and they bump into Patty, and Patty's like, why did you leave? And they try to explain why they left. And Ben, of course, is being a pussy and is like, oh, it's because Agnes was sleeping on the floor. And they were like, well, just because we can't afford anything doesn't mean it's our fault. But Luis is like, no, actually, it's because you were sleeping with Agnes in your bed. And Patty was like, wait, what? And then Kira goes on about how she had a miscarriage and that her motherly instinct went off because Agnes was crying all night for her mommy. So then we cut to Patty and Ben going fox hunting. But of course, Ben doesn't shoot the fox, so they recreate another scene from the original in which they go screaming on this hill. At the same time, Luis and Kira are with the kids, and Aunt tries to write this message to Agnes, but it's in this foreign language. I assume it's in Danish, but he eats it before Kira sees him writing the message. So then we cut back to them all being together again, and we get this other scene from the original in which Patty lies about being a doctor. But this time, it doesn't really lead to anything. So while they're having lunch together, Kira keeps telling Agnes to eat her greens, and she's basically just mothering her. And Luis gets salty about it. And Patty is just like, oh, well, that's how Kira was raised. He's like, Kira, you should apologize. And Luis just keeps looking at him like she could speak for herself. So then we get to this scene that recreates another scene from the original. This time they're outside having lunch and they're doing this dance routine to Cotton Eye Joe. And Patty gets mad because Ant has no rhythm. He throws something at Ant and it makes Ant scared, and he starts berating Ant, which scares Agnes. So he storms off and he takes a nap, and we see Ant taking his keys from him, and he takes Agnes to the barn where we finally find out what's going on. In the original, the person who found out was the dad, Bjorn, but now it's Agnes. And Ant just shows her, even though he can't speak at all, that he isn't really their son, that his parents were killed. And Agnes takes a picture, and Ant tells her that they cut his tongue out and that they intend to make Agnes their next child after killing her parents like they did with his. So Patty wakes up and Ant tries to sneak his keys back, and it was pretty clever how he did it because Patty's like, "Show me love," and Ant awkwardly hugs him, and he goes for a piggyback ride on Patty. So Patty goes back down and he apologizes for everything. So they go to play around with this football for some reason. I don't know why they have a football, because they're in England. So they're throwing around the football, and Ben, of course, throws the ball over Patty's head. And Patty notices that the basement door has been opened because the hay is all missing there. And after that, Ben and Elise finally find out the truth, and they try to come up with this plan to get out of there. Luis grabs his box cutter. So when they're about to leave, they tell Patty and Kira that Agnes just had her first period. Patty is so creepy. He's like, "You're a woman now." And Agnes is just scared for her life. And you eventually find out why Patty said this. So when they're finally about to leave, Patty tells them, "Oh no, you have a flat tire." And they're just scared for their lives. So, of course, Patty offers to change it. And Ben is like looking for a weapon. And even Patty's being playful about it. So after he gets changed, of course, again, and it's in the gutters of the roof, and Patty's like, "Oh, Ant put it up the..." So Ben goes to get it, and Patty almost lets Ben fall off the roof by fidgeting with the ladder. And of course Hoppy is shredded. So when they're about to leave, Patty keeps prying. He's like, "You're never gonna call us again, are you?" And Luis just straight up reveals everything about their infidelity, even though they already both know about it. She's like, "I'm not really happy in my marriage. I want to leave Ben." And she just opens up, and Patty's like, "Honestly, finally." And they finally let them leave. So Ben is like, "Ant, can you open the gate for us?" And Patty's like, "Don't worry, mate." And he opens it with his keys. As they start to drive away, fucking Ant gets thrown into the lake. And of course, Ben runs out to save him, which I don't really blame him. I mean, you really want child blood on your hands. But at the same time, of course, Patty locks the gate. So we cut to the next scene. They're being held hostage, and Patty and Kira are funneling their bank account. So we finally get to the big change of the third act, that they finally fight back instead of letting themselves get killed. So finally they ask, "Why did you do this to us?" And Patty's like, "Because you let us." Even though this line doesn't work at all in this movie. I don't even know why they brought the line back. So Patty's trying to drug Agnes with ketamine. And of course, right before this happens, Luis slashes him in the face with this box cutter. And she fights Kira for her shotgun, and she grabs it. There is some interesting shots in this scene. It's definitely ripping off Straw Dogs. So they all make a run for it. Ben frees them all. But we see the guy from the restaurant earlier, which is different from the original because the babysitter was in on it instead of the guy at the restaurant. So they get shot at and they run back into the house. It's very cat and mouse. we also find out that Kira was also a victim of Patty's, because it's a callback to this line in the restaurant that they've been together for 17 years, even though she's like at most in her early 30s. And Luis makes a comment about it saying, wait, how old was she when they started dating? This is another change they made from the original, because the original Karen was in on it. She wasn't really a victim about anything. She was just as crazy as Patrick was. So the guy from the bar gets killed by Luis because she saves Ben, and immediately afterwards, Kira also gets killed by Luis because Luis sneaks up on her because Kira just pops out the window, and she gets hit in the head with the hammer and she falls off the roof. And of course, Patty's distraught. He's like, no, my Kira. And they have this final confrontation with Patty. Patty charges at them, but he gets injected with ketamine because Agnes had it on her the whole time. As he finally falls to the ground, Ben has the option of killing him. Of course, he doesn't because he's a pussy. And the person who kills him is Ant. And this scene was pretty goofy. Because it looks like Ant is just tapping him with the brick instead of smashing his head in, because we kind of see what happens to his head, even though I don't think him tapping the brick would have done it like that. So they drive off, and the end. So let's get into positives and negatives. I really don't have that many negatives other than the ending was so Hollywood, and the fact that they just really redid everything from the original instead of doing something different. Well, other than the ending. I also thought that some of the scenes were stretched out because this movie's definitely longer than the original. I don't remember if it's 20 or 30 minutes longer. Let's get into the positives. James McAvoy, he's great in the movie. He really embodies the toxic masculinity trait, just like I do, but he's definitely on a different level. I don't think it's one of his best performances because he has so many great ones. He's definitely different in this than he is in Split. I also thought that Mackenzie Davis was really good. She was on a show with Scoot McNairy for like 4 seasons, I think. I don't think they ever dated on the show, though. I'm pretty sure they were just in the same company because it's about a startup. I thought Scoot McNairy was good as playing this absolute pansy cock. It was pretty funny that the whole reason, the tension for their marriage, because he was getting dick pics. Like, what the fuck? Ashley Franciosi, she was pretty good. I also like the look of the movie, even though it's way more sanitized than the original, because the original has this tight, claustrophobic feel, and this one, I guess, it's kind of claustrophobic still, but not really. It just felt like the Hollywood version of the original. I forgot, there's this other negative I have, that the social commentary in this movie doesn't really work because it's all about toxic masculinity instead of Danish culture. Why didn't they just make it about American versus British culture? They really don't do that at all. And also, why would you recreate the exact same movie other than the ending? It doesn't really work in this instance. It's just confusing. When I say this movie is pointless, yeah, but it's still pretty decent. I'd still recommend watching this movie back to back with the original when it comes out on streaming. Definitely watch the original before this one. Yeah, that's all I really have to say. I would give this movie either a 7 or 7.5 out of 10. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Go like, comment, and subscribe. That's all I really have to say. Bye.